Hello and welcome, it's 2025 and I thought we'd start the year with an easy introduction to mixed media illustration, starting with some adorable duckies that I took photos of whilst on a trip to Martin Mere with my dad late last year. I want to show you how to get started with mixed media if it's something that you're not familiar with yet. It can be overwhelming using all these different media in one piece, but I'm going to show you a simple way using only two media that I employ regularly to get some illustrations down in my sketchbook. So here we go. I've got my Clairefontaine 100% cotton paper, which is hot press, so it's nice and smooth, which is quite useful when you're going to be going over with dry media in particular. To make things easy as you get started in your mixed media journey, I'm going to be using paint as my wet layer and then going on top with coloured pencil and some Neo Colour 2s, which I'll talk about a bit later, as my second layer. So straight away you have a mixed media piece. You've got more than one media used to produce an illustration. I think that a water-based paint and some coloured pencils is a perfect way to get started, as they do tend to play well together no matter which you use or which surface you apply them to. They also work well in multiple layers of one on top of the other. Quick pause for my obligatory iced oat latte sip. The first stage in my illustration process is always to block out the main shapes of the animal that I am choosing to illustrate before I go in and add any detail on top. The Gansai Tambi are a Japanese watercolour and they can be applied fairly opaquely, but I'm using them with quite a bit of water so that I'm not covering up too much of the tooth grain in the paper, and it will therefore accept more dry media in the way of pencil and crayon later on. And there's nothing stopping you putting further layers of paint whenever you choose along the process. This is just my preferred way of doing it. The greatest piece of advice I was ever given in art was to paint what you see, not what you know to be there. You want to stop thinking, oh my god, it's a duck, and get sort of fixated about, I must portray it exactly as it is, I must give it exactly the character that I can see before my eyes so that everybody understands that this is a duck. And instead, you want to think in big shapes, block colours, and maybe a little bit of light and shade just to get you started with your illustration. The beauty being that lots of thin light layers means that there's plenty of opportunity to modify the shape and shade of your illustration as you go. You don't have to commit to what the final image looks like as soon as you start applying media to page. And I find it's far less pressure if I leave my outlining, which I think is a fairly integral part of illustration art, until the very last point when I've completed all of my colour application, because then you have a firm idea of what you want your illustration to be, and you're just putting the icing on the cake at the final hurdle there with your pen or pencil. My Gansai Tambi are basically the Art Nouveau set plus a couple of extra greens, an extra couple of blues and a yellow paint, and together they make a very natural palette which is perfect for animal illustration and the landscapes that they tend to be found in. Whilst I find that these are very easy and approachable to get going with an illustration, I certainly don't think it's the only way in. You could use any watercolour or even gouache and you would still be able to follow this process and get the same sort of results in the end. If you're just starting out, it can be quite hard to get other media to go on top of acrylic-based paint. So either acrylic paint proper or acrylic gouache can be a little bit temperamental and it doesn't accept waxy pencils and crayons terribly well. But watercolour paints, Gansai Tambi and gouache in the traditional form tend to work very, very well. So they're great starting points. Please just use whatever you've got and don't let it be a barrier to getting started by not having exactly the same supplies as I do. Just a word about building the page as we go onto the final bird that I'm going to be adding to this double page spread. What I've done is I've started in the top left corner and worked across both pages in my sketchbook, adding birds from my reference photographs pretty much as and when I want to. I didn't have a firm idea of exactly how I was going to lay it out when I started. I just tessellated in the different ducks and one goose as I went along. Once the pages were pretty full, leaving a little bit of room for text as I want to label what the species are once we're finished, I called it a day with the paint layer, left it to dry, and then came back in with my coloured pencils. In this instance, the pencils that I'm reaching for are my Derwent drawing set and my Caran d'Ache Luminance portrait set, both of which work really well for animals and nature-based subjects. They are wax-based coloured pencils which won't reactivate with water, but they are buttery soft and they glide over the top of paint really, really well, and you can get just enough fine detail with them, although they won't sharpen to the crisp, sharp point that a Faber-Castell Polychromos pencil or even a Prismacolor pencil, for example, will do. This stage is really good fun. What we're doing is using our pencils to pick out some of the details of the ducks. So a lot of them have got areas of coloration on their body, they've got large tail feathers, they may have markings on their beak. You may see elements of their feet as well, and you can pick these out with your pencils, add a little shade and light to the areas as appropriate, and just generally add character. I can change the shape ever so slightly here if I want to, so if I've made the body a little bit too big or a little bit too small, then I can rectify that with pencil. And if you were watching carefully there, you may have noticed I actually even managed to rub out with an eraser some Derwent drawing pencil in chocolate because I'd applied too many marks, getting a bit overexcited with that second Brazilian teal duck, and needed to make him a little bit smaller. Whilst you can see a shadow, it's removed, I would say, 90% of the pigment from my page. Now, I said I was going to talk about Neocolor 2s a little bit later on, and here we are, we have arrived at that phase. Now, I keep them with my pencils, and I largely think of them as interchangeable, as there's nothing stopping you using them dry and not applying any water at all. However, I do like the fact that they are reactivated by application of water. This means that you can build up a bit more shadow and shade, add a bit more definition by applying a thick layer, and then using a barely wet paintbrush to just smooth and push it into the areas you want it to be. If you do use them dry though, and you apply them reasonably lightly, you can get quite a nice crayon texture on them, which is really useful if you're trying to replicate fur, feathers, animal skin, etc. a bit more realistically. One thing I've noticed with filming myself is how much I pick up and put down dry media interchangeably all the time. With paint, obviously you tend to have one, maybe two paint brushes on the go at any one time, but with coloured pencils you end up picking them up, doing a couple of strokes, realising you need a slightly lighter or a slightly darker version, and then needing to change it. So for me, I frequently referring back to the reference image to make sure that I'm choosing pencils that represent the colours as I'm seeing them. In some areas, I've added colours which aren't there in real life, partly because I have a limited palette, and partly because, well, it's just fun. I like adding a pop of aqua green or candy floss pink to my animals. It's cute and sweet, and I really like doing it. One thing with the Gansai Tambi is that they are fairly one-dimensional paints when dry, so they do tend to have a fairly flat finish to them, as compared to professional grade watercolours by people like Daniel Smith and Schminker, who make granulating paints that separate and have a beautiful texture just on their own, with no effort on the part of the artist required. So by choosing a similar colour pencil, perhaps in a shade slightly darker, you can add back that texture that you wouldn't have if you were just using the paint alone. This is the beauty of mixed media. It's all about the final finish. It's not about purity and sticking firmly to rules with one medium only. You can do what you like to get the results you have in your brain. Another thing that I really love about mixed media is if you fall in love with a particular supply, then when you come across a subject that uses that colour, then there are absolutely no rules saying you can't use it in your piece. Now, if I'd have come across a particular pink, for example, perhaps I had a soft pastel that would portray it much better than any of the paints or pencils I have in this set. I could have grabbed that, added it to my piece, and been a happy chappy, which I think is really joyful and really playful, and one of the reasons that I love mixed media so much as an approach. It's a license giving you the freedom to think of art in terms of colour rather than slavishly copying every single detail you see before you, whether that's from a reference image or from a live subject. Have I sold you on mixed media being a technique you need to explore yet? Now, for the moment, I'm putting aside my pencils and crayons, and I've gone back to my Gansai Tambi paints. And what I'm doing here is adding some light washes of colour to suggest the water of the ponds where the ducks were swimming, or the grass on which they were standing. And all I want to do is to give a little bit of weight to each animal so that it's sitting on the page rather than floating in negative space. A little word of caution here, try not to add too much detail because you want the focus to be on your animal, not on the environment in which you've placed it. As loose and expressive as you like. Now, here we go, we're putting in the eyes. I leave this to the very end because I, really enjoy doing it, and it's kind of like leaving your favourite mouthful until the last bite of your meal. But also, once I get to the stage where I'm ready to add those eyes, I'm committed and I know exactly where I'm going to place them, rather than putting them in earlier and then ending up them being in a little bit of the wrong location and being unhappy with the overall illustration and not being able to change it at that point. I'm adding in some loose and quite sketchy lines with my Faber-Castell Polychromos in dark sepia, which is my secret weapon for this part of the process. And I really think that this brings your animals to life. Now, the final step is actually adding in some labels, telling you the species of the duck and also where the references came from. In this case, it was Martin Mere Wild Waterfowl Wetland Reserve, which is really quite a mouthful to say. And that, I think, is finally it. We've filled our page with some joyful little duckies, added some labels, given them a little bit of background so there's some context, and largely it's been an exercise in exploring colour and playing with our media. I hope you've enjoyed this and it gives you some inspiration to get started on your own mixed media journey today.